Hi, thanks for coming to watch this video. I'm Alma, and I'm very excited to talk about the research that I did very recently on team narratives. So I called it Team Narratives and Collective Efficacy, a tale of many arcs. And now, how did I actually get to this point? So the first thing is, I've been working as an external consultant in the areas of organizational change, in leadership development. And as I began to work with different industries and companies, I started noticing this thing that was just kind of happening over and over. I started listening and seeing how different areas and departments and teams would talk about, for example, finance would talk about procurement, and procurement would talk about marketing, and et cetera, et cetera. And I kept picking up on these things that I noticed were really stories. They were narratives. They were ways of understanding other areas and even themselves. And I had studied a little bit of literature in undergrad, and I had studied anthropology and sociology, and I kept seeing these things come up and really understanding, like, wow, culture and team and identity all comes together through narrative. But I had never formally studied this. And so as I got into my master's degree program, I knew that something I really wanted to study was what could the role of narrative, specifically narrative in the sense of like how we make sense of things, how we tell ourselves stories about companies, about ourselves within a company, etc. What might be the role of story in all of this work that we try to do to build more effective teams, to build more effective organizations. And so I got this opportunity to really get into it and start studying. So the first thing you do if you've ever done research like this within an academic setting, you've got to do this thing called literature review, right? So you've got to go to what has already been researched, where is the conversation when it comes to these topics. And in order to do that, you need to say, okay, I was going to look at narrative. So I started looking at narrative, storytelling across academic literature, and I found that there's a ton on as you can see in the image, that there's a ton on one end of the spectrum that has to do with the individuals. So on the individual end, and in psychology, there are these terms, right, about narrative identity, and there you can look up the work of Dan McAdams and those who followed after him, and there's more. But then you have on the other end of the spectrum, the organizational sense-making and organizational storytelling. So, for example, Boji et al., etc. A lot of work had been done, big, high-level collective. And what I noticed was, what about teams? And I hadn't thought so much about teams. I had also thought a lot about the individuals and the organizations, and I saw this opportunity to study teams. What about the role of story within teams? So then once you look at this, you start saying, okay, there's a little bit of a gap in the academic literature here. So what exactly do I want to know more about teams and story? Teams and story, teams and story. Well, I want to see what the role of story is within building better teams, but what do I mean by building better teams? And so you start kind of looking for academic terms, and I landed on this one that actually comes from sociology, and it's called collective efficacy. Sounds like a big confusing thing. It's actually pretty simple. It comes from the psychologist Albert Bandura. He was the one who got into self-mastery and self-efficacy. Perhaps you've heard of that. But later in his career, he got really interested in what about this whole idea of self-efficacy, but at the collective level. And the term that he used is a group's shared beliefs in their collective power to produce desired results, especially in the face of challenges. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know what, this term, although it's been used much more in sociology rather than organizational behavior or organizational studies, this term seems more adequate. I would prefer to contribute towards teams that want to have shared beliefs and believe in collective power, right, to achieve their own goals, rather than just team effectiveness or team performance, which can be really performance oriented. So I became interested in collective efficacy, but then you need to think of, okay, collective efficacy, but what exactly am I gonna look at? What's the other part, the other angle, the other academic term that I'm gonna look at during this research? So when I saw collective efficacy, I was like, wow, it's really kind of a mix of these other terms that are really important that most leaders of work teams are trying to build, right? Most meaning people who already believe in human-centered approaches to work, right, and to business. And collective efficacy, what it brings together is like the sense of cohesion, identity, agency, behavioral norms, and all of those are kind of brought together by beliefs. So I was like, okay, I really like this concept of collective efficacy, and I think it's a noble thing to pursue within a team. And personally, a little even better, next level than team effectiveness or team performance. So that's how I landed on that. But now you have to think about like, okay, but what exactly am I going to study to see like what's the role so that I can get to teams that have or don't have or are developing collective efficacy? What exactly am I going to look at? And that's when I came across a term that has been really well studied, which is sense making. And in the end, let me clarify something here. I tend to believe that stories, the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell each other without knowing about it, I'm talking about on an unconscious level, they really are sense making. They are humans' preferred ways to make sense of things. But in the academic literature, very specifically, sense-making has been studied by Weick, Maitlis, Christensen, etc., as the process through which people work to understand issues or events that are novel, ambiguous, confusing, or in some other way violate expectations. So sense-making is a process through which people work to understand issues or events. It's internal. It's what we do inside of our head. And it seems to me that that's one of the things I had been observing for so many years as a consultant. And I wanted to add one extra thing to it, which is narrative sense-making. Narrative sense-making is just this idea that sense-making unfolds through stories and narratives in many forms. So it's an internal process, and it can sometimes be a collective process that is not done intentionally, like, oh, today we're going to sit around and we're going to make sense of this. Not necessarily. That is sometimes done in therapy, that is sometimes done in group therapy, but when I'm talking about work teams, because we're talking in the organizational world, it's not like people sit down and like, we're going to make sense of things, we're going to do sense-making processes. But very naturally, people will make sense of like the last team project they just had, the incident that just happened with a client or with an internal customer, etc., etc. So narrative sense making. So at this point then, I had my two big terms. I knew I wanted to study in teams. What was my research question? After going around in many, many circles, I finally landed on this research question. What is the relationship between individuals' narrative sense making about their team and the development of collective efficacy on their team? And now let's put it all together. If you've done research, if you're familiar with it, you need a research framework, right? So you have the question up at the top, and this is the way that I decided to approach this research specifically. I explored individuals' experiences of being part of a team that has low, moderate, or high collective efficacy, by analyzing how they make sense via stories of these four concepts, which are collective efficacy. You see them on the right-hand side. They are team identity, team cohesion, team agency, and team norms. So there we have it. We have a research framework, so everything is going to go according to plan, correct? But now we get into the actual data collection methods. So what did I do to actually do this? I had three main steps. First step was an initial screening survey to confirm that the people who wanted to participate were on interdependent work teams. So that means not individual contributors, but teams that are measured by their collective output. So as a team, they need each other. They are dependent on each other to be successful. I wanted people that were on teams of at least 4, but no more than 12. And I wanted people who had been on their team for at least 9 months. More was fine. And then they were asked through this survey to basically give me their perception of how much collective efficacy they had. But of course, I didn't use that term because then I would have to explain a lot. So I'll show you what I actually used. Then varied participants were invited, right, to participate. And once I filtered, I was able to do 45 to 60-minute interviews via Zoom. And I focused these interviews on eliciting stories. And I'll get to why I did it that way. So the screening survey, simple, 3 things. Scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree or disagree with these following things? It was, I believe that my team works well together. We reach established team goals. We face challenges together successfully. This also went through a lot of different drafts, but finally I tried to make it as simple as possible. If you analyze those 3 affirmations, you'll see that they are aiming at that definition of collective efficacy without having to tell the participant, hey, I'm measuring collective efficacy. No, I was just talking about those 3 things. So once we got that, I had a total of 11 participants, each one of them on different teams, not on the same team. It's a master's degree, not a PhD, so we didn't have that big of a scope. But as you can see on the screen, we had 4 participants in blue considered their teams to have lower. So I had 4 participants who are in those little blue circles, blue participants who considered that their team has low collective efficacy, 3 in green who are kind of moderate collective efficacy, right? And 4 who consider their teams have very high collective efficacy, so solid 10s. So let's talk a little bit about the interview protocol, because I think that since I really was interested in this internal process called narrative sense making, how do you make visible something that is actually quite invisible, right? It would be different if I were able to talk to the entire team, get them together, talk to each person individually, but in this case, I could only talk to one person. So I couldn't completely study collective sense making, but I could get a sense of their own internal narrative sense making. Now, of course, that's not something that you can just do by asking outright. I can't just say, hey, Natalie, how's it been on your team? Like, what is the sense making you have done about your team, right? Or what's the big story you've told yourself about your team? Most people have no idea how to answer that because they really, quite honestly, are not aware of the sense making that they've done, much less the big story or the narrative that they have about their team. So if you ask them outright, well, first of all, you're gonna prime them to be like, what narratives, what are you talking about? And 2, they're not gonna know how to answer you. So what I've understood and what I've been able to study and practice a lot is something called narrative inquiry or story listening. And it is a technique, it's a research method that focuses on asking questions that elicit stories and getting people to tell you stories of actual things, actual experiences that they've had. So I structured my entire interview protocol around this, because when you listen to people's stories, you'll have a better sense of, first of all, how they're viewing and interpreting the different experiences they've had with their team. And if you ask a series of different questions and get a series of stories without telling them, hey, I'm trying to observe your inner sense making. No. But you just get their stories, then you'll be able to see if there are perhaps any patterns, or maybe there aren't, but you'll have a much better sense of how is it that they have narrated this to themselves. So that's how I structured it. You can look up participative narrative inquiry or the books on narrative inquiry. And also there's some really great books I'll link on story listening. So in the first 10 minutes, I wanted to kind of get them into the mood of like, we're going to talk about your experiences on your team, right? So I did some narrative association questions, asked about an archetypical character, used series like Netflix series, genre, and kind of a first season question that was playful. It helped them like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way. And then I went into actual experiences. So I had 6 story questions. Let's look at those. They all start with tell me about, right? So tell me about, number 1, a ritual or routine that you have with your team or that you do with your team. And then I would have them isolate it and say, like, tell me maybe one of the last times that you had this ritual as a team, or that you practiced it. Then number 2, tell me about a time you felt connected to your team. That way they have to isolate a moment in time with a sensation, and very naturally they will have to tell a story. There's no way around it, right? Tell me about a time you felt disconnected from your team. That way I could have contrast and see what was going on, and how this person makes sense of feeling connected to their team. That's pretty open, right? And feeling disconnected from their team. Number 4, tell me about a challenge you faced as a team. And then I would go into the details of like what exactly happened, etc. Tell me about an achievement you had as a team. And last one, tell me about a time you improved something, whether it be a process, product, whatever, as a team. And finally at the end, I ended with 3 quantitative questions. Just a little bit more about the profile of my participants. We had almost 50-50 male-female, really cool. Age ranges, pretty diverse. Almost half in their 20s, then some 30s, 40s, 50s, which means I got a decent mix of generations. Cultural diversity, heavier on the US, but I did get some global teams. And then you can see that the majority of the teams were in that 8 to 10 people range. And then as far as industries go, I was really happy to get a good mix. We had law represented, tech, finance, healthcare, advertising, higher ed, and professional services and manufacturing. So now I do these interviews, I get a ton of stories. You could do the math, 6 times 11, yeah, a lot of stories. What in the world did I do to analyze this data? How do you analyze 66 stories, right? Well, I had a really nice path and like a scaffolded, I'll do this and then I'll do this and then I'll do this. So like I'll do thematic and then I'll plot out the emotional experience of each story, and then metaphorical associations and an analysis of each participant's narrative arc. That was emergent actually. Then I'll do coding, more traditional qualitative coding, right? Based on each academic construct that I had chosen. And then I'll do an inductive analysis. What other themes or patterns emerged? And then finally I do a big cross analysis. Well, I did do all those steps, but I must say that it was not exactly in that order. The nice, scaffolded, one step after the other. It was a little bit more like this. A little bit of going back and forth, a little bit cleaning up, took way longer than I expected. Then finding, okay, macro narratives, what the heck are these? Then mapping out each story, that took a while. Refining the codes, using deduce, going back, doing another cut, conclusions, going back to it, etc., etc. And let me just remind a little bit about those codes. On the one hand, you have narrative sense making, right? So the 3 main codes there were collective identity, narrative elements, I mean like very much literature narrative elements, metaphors, conflicts, turning points, resolutions. I actually looked at all of those in every story. And then interpretation and sense-making elements that come more from the sense-making literature. And then on the collective efficacy, those 4 big terms, right? Team cohesion or lack thereof, team beliefs, positive, negative, neutral, team behavioral norms, all teams have them, especially interdependent teams, and then team sense of agency or lack of agency. So let's go a little bit deeper into narrative analysis. When I say narrative analysis, I was really asking myself this question, asking the data this question. What can we learn about team identity and beliefs by analyzing the elements of a story? So how do you actually go about doing that? There's many ways, really. But I'm quite fascinated by the late Kurt Vonnegut's work on the shape of stories. So there's actually, well, not surprisingly, a whole story behind his shape of stories. But basically when he was doing his own master's thesis for the University of Chicago, his master's degree was in anthropology, and yet he wanted to study story. Interesting, right? Yeah. So one of the things that he did was he started plotting out hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of stories on an emotional arc. So as you're seeing on the screen, It's a pretty simple X and Y axis that he used. So going up, any arc that would go up meant good fortune or good emotions, both really. And going down meant bad fortune, bad emotions or negative emotions. And then of course, all of this going out through time. A really good example is the Cinderella story shape. So as you can see, Cinderella starts off pretty bad and gets a little bit better. Then of course we have that faithful knight up at the top of the arc, right? Where she meets Prince, whatever his name is, Charming. And things are wonderful until midnight, and then you'll notice that her drop is pretty darn low, but then she comes out on the other side, right? So really this is just to illustrate how through that shape or through that arc, you can not only make visible the actions and the things that happen in the story, but also the protagonist's emotional journey through it. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to try this out with the data that I had as well, apart from kind of traditional deduce coding. So I did, and let's go into those results. Before I get to the results, of course, let's talk a little bit about limitations, always very important. Remember, I had a limited sample size, only one coder, didn't have a budget for other people, right? One coder and her biases, as opposed to a team that can often counterbalance and debate, and no access to the rest of the team of each participant, right? To see to what extent there is any collective sense-making happening. So I had no way of verifying whether the way that one participant told me their stories, right, if anyone else in their team thought the same. Even still, I think there were some pretty decent results. So let's look at this first one. On screen you see, number one, macro narratives develop naturally. First of all, before I continue, what do I mean by macro narrative? This is not a term that is in the literature. I just kind of took the idea of macro, big, overall, overarching, right? And the term narrative and put them together. So you could also think of this as like a big, capital B story. Capital B, capital S, the big story. The story that encapsulates a bunch of other little story. So sometimes you'll hear about this like when people talk in the media, or maybe you talk about yourself and you talk about someone else and you say, oh, they have this narrative about what it's like to, I don't know, live in the US. Oh, they have this narrative about their boss. It may or may not be true. That's not as important as the fact that it is something that is kind of repetitive. It ends up being a lens through which you see the rest of the experiences. So a narrative does have kind of this overarching sense of it's made of a bunch of other stories. So a big story or a macro narrative. I'll just kind of use those two terms interchangeably. So number one, macro narratives develop naturally as individuals sense make over time through more and more team experiences. But how did I even get there? And I want to walk you through this so you know how did she just come to this conclusion? Sure, we know it's true in psychology literature, but like, how do you actually know that that is true based on what you study? Well, on the screen you're seeing an example of a green. So the green participant are the ones who think that their team has very high collective efficacy. And I plotted out a micro story, so a one experience story. In this case, this was, tell me about a time you felt connected to your team. So this is one moment. It happened over a few months, actually it happened over almost a year, that sense of like connection. But this is the way that he told me his story. So first, he starts off kind of low. He's in this new company, it's a remote company, he's trying to find his groove, things are unclear, but the team has this ritual, this routine, which is a virtual hangout time where one person on the team gets to share a hobby and teach the rest of the team how to do this hobby. So it's a very personal thing. It's not technically work related. And 3 months in, it's finally his turn. But he's still kind of there in the negative emotions. But then he gets to present a hobby to his team. And that arc starts going up, and even the way that he talks about it starts going up, because his team loves it. And he has a really fun time, and he starts feeling connected to them. And then team members, this is kind of the top of the arc, they actually reach out to him separately on Slack channels, etc. And they're like, oh, could you do another one? We really love this. I think it was a card game, right? Could you make another session? And he ends up doing another session, but by this time, he is feeling completely connected. So he isolates this moment of feeling connected with this experience, right, that has the beginning, it's not so great, but this experience of getting to share this hobby with his team and see their reaction and start to kind of break the ice, so to speak, that he was feeling with his team. So if you know about story structure, you'll notice that even this story has all of the elements of any other story. So it has a context, it has a clear conflict, it has some rising action, a turning point, the team members reach out to him, right? And then a denouement, or the resolution. This is where he sense makes and he's like, okay, now I'm part of this team. Those were his actual words. So imagine every single story from all the participants. I made these actual mapping out. I plotted out the stories, looked for the narrative elements, for the specific phrases that would give me some insight into how they were sense-making about this. Now, of course, that does require you to ask a lot of follow-up questions, because sometimes you start with the question, hey, tell me about a time when you felt connected. Maybe they give you a bare bones version, and so you have to kind of double click and like, can we zoom in on this? But what exactly were you feeling? Or, oh, how did they reach out to you? So I remember asking him things like, all right, and then was this on Slack? What was this like? And what did they actually ask you to do? And what were you feeling, or what was going through your head at that moment? And that's how I was able to make sure that I had enough meat on this story to really be able to analyze what were for him the kind of the conflict, the rising action, the turning point, and the denouement. Okay, so you do this plot, you plot it out for every single story, and then something really interesting happened. I actually didn't plan for this to happen, but I started to notice that from the moment that they joined the team until kind of present day, where they're reflecting back and telling me stories of things that have already happened, right? I noticed that I was able to see them on the timelines. So without even asking for it and not meaning to do anything chronological, because I would ask follow-up questions like, oh, did this happen before you did the hobby presentation? Oh, this happened before, and then, oh, this challenge was, I was able to, in the end, to see those 6 stories more or less in a timeline for each one of the participants, which was really, really nice, because then I could get at least a sense of how maybe their story about their team changed, evolved, developed over time. So remember, then that's when I started seeing this pattern emerge of a narrative, a big story that results from the interpretations of a series of similar lived experiences or stories. So since we were talking specifically about their experiences on their team, those are all similar experiences, and I began to see that their big story was like a lens that colors the way that we sense make about current and future related experiences. Unless, of course, that big story is challenged. So, as you can see, I was able to string together and realize that there were macro narratives, macro team narratives. So now not only could I plot out each little story, but I could see how each little story was part of a much bigger story that ended up being more continual. So if we go back to that first participant I told you about with high collective efficacy, what you can see now is the plotted out version of his big story, his macro narrative about his team. And since he perceives his team to have high collective efficacy, that arc at a certain point just kind of stays at a steady upward curve, which is really important to know. And what you can see on the screen are little excerpts from different stories and where they were. Those were the ones that would help me plot out this arc. Now, of course, this was true for the green participants, but it was also very true for the blue participants, which means, as you can see from this participant, this particular participant started with their team in 2019 and then told me these stories right in January of 2023. And after 6 stories, I was able to see, wow, there was this wonderful, wonderful team at the beginning. Then, of course, COVID hit. That's not only team related, but it affected his team in a very specific way. Then back to office, a little bit of going up with a mastermind group, then a new manager, kind of new norms, figuring out how to do the best with limited resources. And now he's at a point where he's been at really for over a year, as you can see, where it has become a big disconnection story. At least for the last year and a half, the big story that he has about his team is about a disconnected team. That is the narrative. And it has been more and more reinforced. So to give you, there are some excerpts you can see on the screen, some of the phrases that I would come across for people with high collective efficacy. For example, this one. For the first 3 months, there was a pretty big feeling of disconnection and not really knowing kind of what was going on. There's some context. There's his emotional interpretation, right? They were doing this, etc., etc. And then I wasn't involved, so we're still in the lower arc. But then after I found my groove and then had that presentation, that's when I kind of felt like I was really part of the team and ingrained in the team as a whole. And you know, now at this point, like I can totally understand when new people are coming on board. I totally understand how they're feeling. So that paragraph really shows his own sense-making process. I don't know whether this is the first time he's reflected on or he's already reflected on this before, but he has clearly reflected on how that first story began to shape the way that he saw his team. But let's move to that second result out of 3. Second result, macro narratives solidify over time as the individual sense makes about more team experiences. So it is pretty intuitive, but it's nice to see it plotted out. So what I did on the graphic there was kind of make a thicker line to visualize or to symbolize how some of the sense making that starts to happen as we get closer to present day begin to demonstrate very similar themes in their narratives, right? The same types of phrases are repeated. I noticed that they're telling those stories that happen in those time frames with a lens that is already very similar to a lens that was told at the beginning. So I'll give you an example. It happens in both cases, both green and blue, high and low self-efficacy. A green example would be, we have a capable team here. We can do it. Phrases like that were repeated a lot, even in the stories 3, 4, 5, and 6. Whereas some of the sense making that happened in the blue team was, our team really just went downhill from there. That's a very good example of someone who has already come to a conclusion about the story of the team. For that person, it's already in a negative fall, and something pretty miraculous would need to happen for them to change the story, change the big story that they have about their team. For this person speaking, there was a turning point that led to a negative resolution, and it already happened a while ago, and there's not much that can change that story in their head. So those were the 2 big conclusions about those big stories. But then I also found something that was pretty interesting to me, which is that connection routines contribute to sense-making processes. So remember that the first question that I had was, tell me about a time, or tell me about a ritual or routine that your team has, and give me an example. Tell me a moment of this routine. So what was really interesting is that those participants who came from teams with low perceived collective efficacy couldn't really share much about routines, or the routines that they had were more transactional, down to business routines, and not actually connection routines, which is why this result is about connection routines, right? Frequent connection rituals and or routines appear to reinforce positive collective identity and sense-making, and therefore positive macro team narratives. So what do we mean by that? What were some of the examples of connection routines? Because what I found is that these connection routines were actually kind of a protagonist in a lot of the connection stories of those with higher perceived collective efficacy. So examples from my study include weekly virtual lunch calls in which team members facilitate a personal hobby learning, right? Some of them had gratitude rituals that were pretty consistent. There was a Friday afternoon virtual happy hour with games that worked for that team. And daily meetings, normal for most work teams, right? But daily meetings that had built-in time for shooting the breeze, as this participant called it. So when you plot it out and you put it actually on that narrative arc, the story shapes that I've been working on, right? I began to see those consistent little moments. You can see them as little white circles where you're like, oh, there's actually these really consistent moments where they are connecting. And maybe, just maybe, that's where some of the green teams are able to do some of their sense making together. Now that's just a theory because I had no way of actually confirming that. But I can say with confidence that all of the higher collective efficacy teams had very consistent connection routines and rituals. Whereas individuals on teams with low collective efficacy reported not having any rituals or routines that involved connection. They only had the types of routines that were like team meetings, but Slack things, sending something on Microsoft, but there wasn't actually a moment for connecting built into those routines. A very good example from one of the participants who was on a blue team said, and candidly, I've been feeling not super connected to this team, and I've never thought about it as like a lack of routine or ritual. And then she mentions kind of a weekly agenda that they send out every Monday, but she says, but it's so about work, and it's like, it's not uniform. There's no play. All right, so we have these three results. People develop macro narratives about their team, identity, for better or for worse, right? And then those big stories, they tend to solidify, like get more rigid, like become more accepted internally as the truth, right? Like that example I gave about, and it all went downhill from there. That's pretty significant for anyone on your team to all of a sudden, or at any point in time say, oh, it went downhill from there, or oh, it all went uphill from there. That's gonna affect a lot the way that they show up in a team. So what are one of the things that you can do, or one of the things that you might wanna pay attention to, since those internal sense-making processes are going on always, whether you like it or not, whether you're aware of it or not, everyone on your team is doing it, you're doing it right now, right? One thing that you can pay attention to is how many spaces do you open up so that people can have moments to connect and perhaps collectively sense make about their team experiences together. So some of the other practical implications are, just remember, people make sense of their team experiences through stories and narrative elements. There's no getting around that. But narratives are malleable. They can be challenged. They can change. If they get more and more rigid over time, it's a little more challenging, but they can be changed, right? So my main questions for you after going through all of this research, what I've been thinking about, talking about, the way that I went about talking with the participants and eliciting their stories, some questions I might leave you with are you paying attention to the types of narratives that are being construed on your team? Are you listening for them, right? And finally, having to do with those connection routines, do you facilitate spaces so team members can sense make together? If you are interested in doing more of this, my final tips would be learn about story structure, because it's the way that humans make sense of experiences in life, period. At work, outside of work, on the toilet, wherever. Maybe not on the toilet. But anyways, learn about story structure. Pay attention and listen to how people make sense of their team experiences, right? How they talk about it. how they think about it, how they process, what they write, what emojis do they use, right? Create frequent spaces for people to collectively sense make. And finally, consider co-designing light, playful team connection routines. Emphasis on light and playful because those words came up a few times. Don't have enough evidence to say for sure that they're really important, but they did appear to be really present in teams with high perceived collective efficacy. So that's all I've got for you. Thanks for listening this far. Thanks for coming on this journey with me. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to leave some links, but I want to leave you with this last final quote from some researchers in the field of organizational storytelling that I think kind of encapsulate everything I've been talking about, and I hope leave you with something to think about as well. Here it goes. Humans are in actions and practice, as well as fictions, essentially storytelling animals.